Is this working? Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to this event that is co-sponsored by the Center for Latin American Studies, European Studies, the Ehrlich Eminent Scholar Chair in the Department of Political Science. And please join me to welcome to the University of Florida, Professor Federico Finchelstein. He is a professor of history at the New School for Social Research and at the Eugene Lang College. And he's also the director of the Jenny Program for Latin American Studies at the New School for Social Research. Federico is an extremely prolific and interesting historian. He's the author of 7 books on fascism, populism, dirty wars, the Holocaust, and Jewish history. His book has been translated to several languages. I would like to briefly mention some of his publications. Transatlantic Fascism moved debates on fascism from Europe to its transatlantic connections in Latin America. His volume on the ideological origins of the dirty war focuses on the history of fascism in Argentina, the transformation of fascism into populism with General Perón, and how the fascist idea of the total enemy led to brutal human rights abuses under the dictatorships of the 1970s. It's a fascinating and very difficult book to read. And Federico was telling me that it was very difficult to write. His path-breaking book, From Fascism to Populism in History, focuses on the history's intellectual debates, transnational links, and the similarities and profound differences between these two authoritarian movements and political regimes. Federico published A Brief History of Fascist Lies in 2020, and his new book on fascist mythologies will be available soon, in a couple of months, in June. Today, Dr. Finchelstein will lecture on the topic of his new book. The intriguing title of his presentation is From Populism to Fascism. Please help me to welcome Federico.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Carlos, and also Michael, for having invited me here. It's such a pleasure to be here. I will start with explaining this yes, a strange title, because actually it's the opposite of the title of this book, which is From Fascism to Populism. So you see where I'm going with this. And the title actually shows where I'm going, because I'm now writing the number 3. And one colleague was joking that whether this is a trinity or a trilogy. I prefer the trilogy explanation rather than the trinity, because I don't think they are unified in sacred terms, but rather like there are different approaches to the same topic or to the same question. And the question is, to bring it down to one sentence, is what's going on? and because I'm an historian, I try to answer that question by connecting or trying to establish or to see the connections, rather than establish, to see the connections between past and present. And in that sense, if this book, From Fascism to Populism, in this book I try to see how, fascism was not populism, precisely because when populism first arrived to power in Latin America after 1945, it was very different to what fascism had been, and yet many of these people, many of these leaders were connected to fascism, or actually they were, or they had been fascist and dictators. So my point is that I saw, and I still see, 1945 as a kind of epochal turn. Obviously, I'm saying something very obvious. Who will not agree that like the tripolar world, like liberalism, socialism, and fascism world before 45 became a bipolar world with a Cold War and so on. So 45 obviously was, or many historians or most historians will agree that a lot of things changed in 45. My argument was that one of the things was that fascism reformulated itself as a new form, which was called populism. So that was the argument in the book. So that basically the book implies a critique of many colleagues working on populism, but working on European cases. And I feel like almost redundant saying this, sitting next to Carlos de la Torre, who is like the major expert on Latin American populism, and precisely because of that, one of the major experts on populism per se. But I would say it anyway. I mean, and Carlos and I, we have been insisting on this, on the importance of analyzing the Latin American cases, not only because Latin America is important, but also because they were the first cases of a form of government that eventually expanded to or was reformulated in other global places. So the point that was the point in the book. So 1945, an epochal change. In order, I mean, the first chapter of this book, I was dealing with what is fascism, what is populism, and then by the end of it, like I will tell you a personal story now. When I finished the book, was around, I will say, sometime in 2015. Okay, so the book was finished, and in that early version of the book, I mean, I had to say sorry. I knew the book was going to be published somehow in 2016, and in that first version of the manuscript, I said I was referring to what I saw already as changes in populism. In this case, the case of Trumpism. I don't know if you heard about Donald J. Trump, but I'm sure you did. But then you will be like, you never know. I mean, we historians, like, we study the past. We are really bad in studying the future. We have no clue. And actually, it was an example of that, because I said, when I was talking about this new form of populism, or the example in America of that new form of populism, I said, like in several parts of the manuscript, in his failed bid to the presidency, the candidate, Donald J. Trump. So my editor actually said, I mean, Kate Marshall, the editor at UC Press, that published the book, said, just in case, why don't we wait a little bit until we see the results of the elections, and then you finish the manuscript after it, if you have to do a little change here or there. Of course, in addition to being, like, as a citizen, shocked and depressed after the election, the electoral results, and I was among those that were surprised and shocked. I mean, many people that I know, from New York and other places, they said, I was saying that this was going to happen, but from them I never heard it. So anyway, I was living in my own world in which I could not perceive this, although I was insisting on the changes that this new populism represented. And so I waited. I mean, as I said, like, the electoral results implied, a lot of things as a citizen, but as an author, it implied changing a lot of parts in the book. Because one of the arguments, and here the discussion with some European colleagues or people working on Europe, is that it is important to study populism not only as an opposition movement, but also as a power regime, or, I mean, to study populism power, and thereby you need to also focus on Latin America. But then we had, like, for the first time in the history of the world, that a populist leader became the leader of the most powerful country in the world. So anyway, like, in a way, it's not that the argument was changed, but it was already mentioning, or it was already mentioned. So that was the case with that book. Then I published another one on an aspect of this, correlation, or things that are going on. And by things that are going on is, if populism basically was a reformulation of fascism in a democratic key after 1945, precisely because it left behind key elements of fascism. More on that, in some minutes. I will return to this issue. Then what we see with this new wave of populism is that they seem to be returning to those elements that to those fascist elements that early populists left behind. So that's why, if this was to put it now, to go back to the, how I started, if this was from fascism to populism, the question is whether we are seeing a return from populism to fascism. In a way, are we witnessing an unmaking of populism? Populism, of course, is a form of authoritarianism that involves democracy, insofar as democracy is left behind, for example, by coup d'etat, then what is left of populism? Anyway, so I'll be back to this also in a second. So what I propose, I mean, in my own approach is is a dialogue with esteemed colleagues in political science and sociology, a critical dialogue, by the way, but a dialogue. Because on one hand, like basically, there is, I mean, obviously Carlos is a huge exception to this pattern, I mean, because he is as invested in history as I am. But what we see in other bibliographies on populism is that populism is presented as something without a history. And then on the other hand, the few historians that engage with this concept of populism, they do so sometimes without much concern from what, basically what we can learn from sociology and political science, and and political theory and other conceptual approaches to it. So basically, I propose my, in this book and then in the following one, like to connect the two. Now, I would like so if I have to sum up, I would say, well, what I'm trying to do is propose a historical perspective to think the current crisis. And actually, that historical perspective, which is also critical, allows you to see also how the current crisis of politics or democracy or what have you is also manufactured. And thereby, we are going back to some elements which in many ways, populism had left behind. One of them was the topic of my previous book, which is the history of fascist lies. Because never in the history of populism, they lie so much as a Goebbels, a Hitler, or a Mussolini. But also never in the history of populism, at least in the 20th century, populist leaders lie so much as Donald J. Trump or Jair Bolsonaro. And I don't mean quantity only, but also quality, in the sense that, populists, like other political traditions, will, politicians lie. That's part of the deal. I mean, as Hannah Arendt said, like this goes back to, ancient Greece, and we can find other examples in other regions. But they don't believe in their lies, A. And B, they don't want to change the world in order for the world to be like their lies. And this is a typical major facet of fascism, not of populism. They are more, in a way, conventional, the populists. And yet we see this new branch of populism, this new wave, which, as in other aspects, goes back to fascism. So from populism to fascism. Another element that I would like to raise is the issue of, I mean, if I propose a historical perspective that establishes a dialogue with, with sociology and political science, as well as other disciplines, what I don't think, we should have is, or let's put it another way, how not to think about these issues, is in a way that is ethnocentric. And by that I mean like Eurocentric or Americanocentric, in the sense that approaches that disregard global South histories are lacking key elements, especially one of those is the issue of power. And I think this is, in Carlos' work, this is one of the, a key issue of your critique of the work of Casmude, for example. And so this is an issue that I think sadly affects the bibliography in general, and certainly what I will call now the new experts on this issue. I don't think, I'm sorry to speak, also, to speak as a we, but people like Carlos and I, that we have been working on this issue for decades, I don't think we own it, and everybody can work on it, of course. And yet, there is a kind of emergence of new experts on these issues of populism, and yet also fascism, and yes, also fascism, that seem to be, in a way, agreeing with their sources, with their actors, with their objects of study, on the uniqueness and newness of the phenomenon they are studying. So, with the characteristic lack of humility that is so prevalent in the character, Donald J. Trump once said that there is a way to analyze the current time in more conceptual terms. Well, he never said that exactly, but he proposed a more conceptual approach to it in a way, in his own way. And he called the current times the age of Trump. And as correct or as incorrect that might be, I think as social scientists, we need to, have a little bit of this belief when we deal with these people and not necessarily agree with that premise that this is so new that we don't need to study other histories or other periods or other regions of the world. I think it is a problem, but that provides a shortcut in a way, because for these new experts on populism and on fascism, I will add, if this is the case, then you don't need to read much. You just don't quote anyone who has worked on this issue and present your approach to the age of Trump as extremely original and unique insofar as it doesn't connect to any other works by following the premises of the leader. Very problematic, a kind of identification of the expert with the topic of study in uncritical terms. And for these new experts, I have a simple message, which is what, if we are professors, we tell our students. I mean, or if we are students, we tell to ourselves. We need to do the homework. Before engaging in researching a subject, we read what other people wrote about it. So sometimes, like, people that have been working on this for a long time, is with some perplexity that we see these claims, which sometimes are very much supported by, in the papers or in the magazine and so on, or in websites, as the new thing on the block, as the new kid on the block of the studies of these issues, where basically notorious key authors are lacking, such as, for example, the Italian-Argentine sociologist Gino Germani. Totally absent in most of these works, as he's one of the first to have analyzed these issues. Also in terms of the connections between fascism and populism, by the way. So what is new? And this is a key question, right? Of course. I mean, what is new? If there is no history behind, it's very hard to explain what is new, because then you don't see continuities and you don't see change. So from no history, of course, my proposal, as expected as it could be, because I'm an historian, is yes, more history, no history, yes, history. And a history that needs to be not necessarily a history of the margins. Some of us work on the margins, and some of us do not work on the margins, but rather on the centers. But a history that incorporates the particular dialectic between center and margins. And here I would like to quote this fantastic quote by Etienne Balibar, who said, sometimes you can better understand even the center by studying the margins. And sometimes vice versa. But people, if you work on Latin America or other parts of the global south, you know that you also have to read about the center. Whereas our dear colleagues that work with the center certainly don't have to read about the margins. And my point is, like, I mean, personally, I don't need to be cited, but I just that is, it will be more interesting to learn about the center by with the studies that have incorporated what goes on in other places, and to have a better full picture of the thing. Then there is the rise of another expert, especially on fascism. They don't talk about populism much, but they talk about fascism a lot. And this expert I will call the non-expert, because the new experts are the ones that are dealing with the topic without engaging with the bibliography. But the non-experts are those saying there is no connection with fascism in what we are seeing in the present. But first, they don't work on fascism, most of them. And second, because of that, they really lack a kind of updated idea of what's going on in the bibliography. So they say no without knowing what saying yes will mean. So we have a lot of educated guesses. And these educated guesses, I mean, this is the so-called fascism debate, in which is not really a debate, but there were some people saying this is fascist and some others saying this is not fascist. And my concern is the ones, or many, including some colleagues, some historians, who were saying this is not fascist because this is not like Hitler. They first really ignore what the bibliography of Nazism and global fascism is about, And second, they went back to some problems which are typical of the new experts, and even all experts, which is Eurocentrism or Americanocentrism. In the case of Eurocentrism, the idea will be that, for example, Trump cannot be fascist because he's not like Hitler. But if you study fascism, you know that Hitler was an example, a radical example, certainly the most radical example of a global trend. So then they also confuse, or I would say they magnify the notion of analogy as if this is the only thing that people working on fascism do, where in fact analogy is not as important as continuities. Continuity and yes, change, rather than analogy. So basically people are working on fascism and making these sort of connections, I include myself here, we are not using analogy or comparative history. We are trying to establish continuities, which are often present. Like, I mean, the case that, that Carlos made reference to my book on the origins of the dirty war. What I did in that book is I started with the fascists Argentine fascists in the 1920s and 30s, trying to understand the legacy and the actual continuities, sometimes even personal continuities of these ideologies up to the 1970s. So this is not really whether Steve Bannon is like, or in Brazil, Olavo de Carvalho is similar to Julio Cébola, but rather trying to analyze why they are so much influenced by Julio Cébola, noted fascist, Italian fascist occultist. So here there are a lot of confusions, and here, I mean, I think, history can help. The history of fascism and populism can help. How much time I have? Because I know Carlos asked me to speak for only 30 minutes, and I say only, I mean, I don't know if we are already done with 30 minutes, so I will take. Oh, okay, so I have a lot of time. I was going to make a joke that I'm from Argentina, and for an Argentine, 30 minutes is like not a lot. So we are famous for speaking a lot, so I will try to be as not Argentine as I can be. And the other thing, I mean, I made reference to Eurocentrism, but I now would like to talk about Americanocentrism, which is that there are no connections. I mean, and here I would like to stress this. When I say connections with fascism between the present and fascism, I don't mean they are fascist. This is a question that we should be asking. And my problem with this naysayer is that they don't want to ask the question. They say the question is irrelevant or illogical. Because they believe in an analogy that has to be related to a sort of full identification. Yes. Bolsonaro doesn't have the mustache like this, so he cannot be like Hitler. And by the way, many fascists did not have that mustache because they were not like Hitler. They were Italian fascists, Indian fascists, Brazilian fascists, and so on and so forth. So in terms of Americanocentrism, the issue is, and here there are two different hypotheses going on, which are of course mutually exclusive. One is somehow, again, another super problematic misreading of what fascism was about. You know what? These guys are not very learned. They don't read much. They are not intellectuals. They are just, part of what is the history of the American right, but they are not like the fascist intellectuals. And, and you tell me how many intellectuals, as the term might imply, were in Nazism. I can count what? Heidegger, Schmidt, and half of another intellectual. That's it. Or I don't know, I'm kind of being ironic here. But the point is that this correlation that is established between fascism and intellectual deepness or complexity is very problematic. It's extremely problematic. So not reading a book doesn't, or not being informed about the world not necessarily disqualifies you as a fascist. Au contraire, sometimes it helps. And the other thing is that, so the idea is that we are, I mean, the hypothesis, the Americanocentric hypothesis is like, either we are too dumb to be fascist, our right is too dumb to be fascist, which somehow oddly establishes a kind of, or elevates, Nazism or other forms of fascism in intellectual terms. I mean, and I say oddly because not necessarily it was a high intellectual achievement in the history of humanity. I mean, Nazi ideology, quite the opposite actually. Or the other one, which is, also ethnocentric, but in a different way, is that we are too much of a democracy to have a fascist situation here. So our institutions are strong, liberalism is strong, constitutional democracy is so strong that this is not really, like these guys might sound extreme, but there is no danger to democracy in this country. So this is much like the same. And sometimes this is presented as a kind of oddly anti-intellectual kind of leftist critique. That basically they see no disconnection, rather a lot of continuity, let's say, between previous administrations, especially democratic ones, including Obama and Trump. So they will stress continuities. And I kind of joke that this is the argument that you can make from a townhouse in Brooklyn, but if you live in other parts of the US, or if you are not, part of the majority, but rather a minority, probably you felt, perhaps, I mean, and this is an open question, we could ask a lot of people here, where there was change vis-a-vis the policies of the new administration in terms of discrimination, in terms of repression, and so on and so forth. So these are the arguments that I'm discussing with. At this point, I would like, to briefly read actually, this is the boring part of my talk, but I would like to be really faithful to my book. And I would like to read briefly a kind of very succinct definition or working definition of both fascism and populism to analyze and finish with the changes that we are seeing. So I will now present fascism, as a global ideology with national movements and regimes. It was a transnational phenomenon inside and outside Europe, a modern counter-revolutionary formation. It was ultra-nationalist, anti-liberal, and anti-Marxist. There are other elements. It was against democracy. It basically dissolved the distinctions between the private and the public, the state and civil society, independence of the press, many things that you know, basically. I'm not illuminating you with these basic attributes of fascism. It presented a radical form of a political religion, apocalyptical views, messianism. I can add many elements. Actually, there are different elements, different definitions, but basically, most people will agree on certain attributes of fascism. Some of these attributes were transferred to populism, in this kind of reformulation. And populism, and here I give a list of things about populism. Again, I feel I'm talking next to a major expert on populism, so, you can have, in Carlos' last book also, an incredible approach to this. But for the sake of argument, I will just say a couple of things. It is an attachment to an authoritarian electoral anti-liberal democracy that practically rejects dictatorship. It is an extreme form of political religion. So you see where I'm going. Actually, with the practically, we are already seeing a difference between populism and fascism, that rejection of the dictatorship in practice. With the second element, an extreme form of political religion, populists also do have that. Apocalyptic vision of politics, they do have that, they share that. A political theology, they do share that with fascism, and so on. A weak understanding of the rule of law, a tendency to shortcut the distinctions between civil society and the state, a tendency to limit the free press. So here, tendencies. In a way, not, we see already some distinctions with fascism. A claim of anti-politics, like the fascists, an identification of movements and leaders with the people as a whole, a notion of the leader as the personification of the people, the act of speaking in the name of the people and against the ruling elites, a self-presentation as standing for true democracy against enemies of democracy. This is very interesting. Sometimes even the fascists will do that. Franco, for example, after the war, called for elections to confirm. Eventually, the elections confirmed that he was elected or confirmed as president for life. And he said, these are the most democratic elections in the history of Spain. Of course, after the Civil War, a lot of people killed, most opposition politicians killed or in exile, and so on and so forth. And the guy claimed to be, the most democratic leader. A deep antagonism and even aversion to independent journalism, a dislike for pluralism and political tolerance, a stress on popular culture, and even in many cases on the world of entertainment as embodiments of national tradition. Okay, so all these attributes of populism you could see in someone like Bolsonaro and Trump. So the question is, and this I want to go back to my main argument, is what makes populism vis-a-vis fascism? Which are the distinctions? Which are the differences? And this is something that I'm stressing in my new work, in my new book, which I hope to publish in a couple of years. I'm sharing like this initial research. The title of the book so far, I mean, it might change, but the title is The Wannabe Fascist. It's a very vernacular title. And I'm referring to the connections between the new populism and fascism. Now, let me now basically to sum up. If I have to say which are, and I don't have to generally, like we have in a way, the privilege of writing books that we have a lot of time and pages to explain things. But if you put me in the corner and you say, explain, and I have been put by friends, journalists, and even enemies, I'm joking, no enemies, on the corner and say, explain to me fascism. In a birthday party, okay, what is fascism? So I have been confronted with this issue and I wanted to provide an answer which is more succinct and certainly less boring than what I just read, okay? Meaning my previous book on this. So, and I came down with these 4 elements which I call the pillars of fascism, the foundations, the columns of fascism, in which if you don't have these elements, you don't have fascism. Now, interestingly enough, these are the 4 elements that the populists left behind. When populism emerges as a form of, as a regime after 45, they explicitly reject these elements of fascism. And some of them, like my compatriot, General Juan Domingo Perón, they do this explicitly. They will talk about how problematic it is to engage in these elements, which I call the 4 elements or the 4 pillars. And these pillars or 4 elements are 1, violence and the militarization of politics. They are all connected, by the way, dependent on each other in fascism. Number 2, lies and propaganda. And here, let's return to this thing that I said, that when they engage in lies, they not only lie, but believe they are lies, and worse, they want to change the world in order for the world to be reconfigured or to be like the lies. I will return with a terrible, horrible example, but very illustrative example of this situation in a second. Number 3, what I call the politics of xenophobia. An extreme form of the discrimination that engages in high levels of repression, at some point even extermination. And this politics of xenophobia, in so many cases, involve racism. And here another corrector, like the idea will be all historiography. Historians like 40 years ago, they said, no, the difference between Italian fascism and Nazism is that the Italians were not racist. Wrong. Wrong. We have a lot of work on Italian racist policies in Ethiopia and other parts of Africa, which then were taken up into their own racial laws in 1938. So the enemy, the racial enemy might change, but racism was there since the beginning. And this applies to most forms, if not all forms of fascism. The fascists, for example, in Peru, they were not so anti-Semitic, but rather anti-Asian. Their concern was immigrants from China. Same perhaps with the Colombian Leopardos. In Brazil, someone like Gustavo Barroso, one of the leaders of Brazilian fascist integralismo, will say, we are better than them, meaning the European fascists, because Brazil provides this integration of black populations of African origin, white European populations, and Native Americans. So we are creating a better race. And in this kind of racial creation, no place for the Jews. So he was more into anti-Semitism. So we should not conflate racism and anti-Semitism, but when talking about fascism, we are talking about xenophobia and racism. That's a key element of fascism. From India to Colombia, from Italy to wherever other fascist movement you want to find. So element number 3, xenophobia. And finally, a key element, dictatorship. So there is, you can have dictatorship without fascism, but there is no fascism without dictatorship. Now, these 4 elements were constitutive of fascism, and they were explicitly absent in cases of populism after 1945. So low levels of violence, low levels of militarization of politics, certainly vis-a-vis the fascists, low levels of glorification of violence, and even if it was glorified, it was rhetorical, never put in practice. I mean, there is this famous quote from Perón. He said, to our enemies, we should not consider them human. They are like snakes, and they should be killed like snakes. What did Perón do? Nothing. Nothing. In fact, like anti-populist dictatorships that emerged and toppled Peronism were way more violent than General Perón. And here there is the image. I don't know if you have seen these hats. The other day I was in Westchester. I saw a guy with a hat that said, lions, not sheep. Have you seen this? It's a line of clothing, actually, that now they are selling. And I was thinking, this guy knows where this is coming from? Because there is his famous quote, better to live one day as a lion than, a lot of time as a sheep. Mussolini said that. That quote in 2015, I think, was tweeted by Trump. And when he was told that Mussolini said that, well, the phrase is, the sentence is truthful, even I don't care who wrote it, it's an original thought. So now it's a kind of slogan of the American, of American white supremacy and Trumpism. And guess what? Perón knew the phrase. And he, Perón presented himself as quite tellingly, he said, I am a vegetarian lion. And that is a perfect image of what populism is about. Roaring, but, not eating the enemy. Roaring against the enemy, but not eating. So the problem is, like, let's say now if we say 3 waves of authoritarianism, the one of the fascist years finishing in 45, I will now say the wave of populism or classic populism from 45 to probably the end of the, of the 20th century. Still going on, of course. Like many populists are populists. They are not, what I call wannabe fascist. And then the wave of the wannabe fascist, or the would-be fascist, or the aspirants to fascism. And here, I mean, before January 6th, I was thinking, they are lacking the 4th element. Because let's imagine now someone like Jair Bolsonaro, Jair Messias Bolsonaro, or Trump. There is a big place for violence, the militarization of politics in their politics. Element number 1. That makes a fascist a fascist. Number 2, lies. Well, do I have to talk? I mean, I wrote a book on this, but do I have to remind you that the way these people lie is not the typical way in which politics are about? And by the way, I promise you an example. I will give you one of the worst, gruesome example of how this works. So the Nazis operated with a major lie, which said that Jews were dirty and spread disease. This is, of course, a lie, major one. Then what did they do? They put Jews in ghettos and concentration camps with horrible sanitary conditions, in which eventually Jews became dirty and spread disease. And a Nazi would say, see, but this is the way it operates. It's a manufacture of reality, the manufacture of reality in order for reality to resemble propaganda or lies. And basically then they kill them. Because they said, if ideology says they are dirty and spread disease, we should kill them. But they had created the conditions for ideology to be confirmed in the artificial reality of a ghetto or a concentration camp. Now, when I was like, I was asked by my publisher to write a preface to the paperback edition of my book on fascist lies. When I was asked that, I was confined in my apartment in New York when New York was the epicenter of the virus. And we saw in Brazil, the US, and other places this kind of manufacturing of lies with the outcome of producing mass death, denying science, denying disease, and the outcome being death. And we saw how, even in terms of element number 2, pillar number 2 lies, these people were returning, not to populism, but to fascism. Xenophobia. I would say this: there is no fascism without xenophobia. You can have xenophobia without fascism, obviously. But here, check. Element number 3, can you understand Bolsonaro, Trump without xenophobia, hatred, demonization? An extreme one, actually. One that actually leads people to be weaponized and go about and even kill people. And then element number 4, which I said, this shows the limit here. Like, these people are still populists in their attachment to democracy. Populists, as you know, in history, either they are toppled by others or they lose, they don't like it, and they go. Even when they say the people were wrong, they were misled, they recognize electoral results and they go. This is a kind of defining element of populism. When Perón was toppled, the choice was civil war and go. And he didn't like civil war because that implies high levels of, incredible levels of violence and demonization. And he said this leads to the destruction of politics. There is nothing good can come out of violence. Now, when you read fascist, you don't have to. In a way, the joke is that I'm reading this. If you are not interested in reading this, you don't have to, because people like us, our job description is to read this awful text. I mean, you will find that in fascism is the opposite. That violence is the creator. It implies creating great things, power, beauty, and a better world. I mean, this is, in a way, populism then is more connected to other traditions, which they see violence as a means, not necessarily as an end. I mean, in that way, to put this in sociological terms, in Weberian terms, populists agree with other political traditions that the monopoly of violence is important and is a source of power. That violence leads to the pacification of social space. That violence is not to be used, because that will mean less power, no more power. Fascists disagreed with that. They were anti-Weberians because they thought that, yes, it's important to achieve the monopoly of violence, but once you have it, you first engage in an internal war, destroying the foe, destroying the enemy by imprisonment and physical elimination, and eventually you externalize that violence through total war. Of course, it took 20 years for the Italian fascists to do this. It took at least a decade or a little bit less for the Nazis to do this, and so on. So the point is that these 3 elements, violence, lies, xenophobia, I will take 2 more minutes and I finish, I promise. They were pretty evident, to me at least, when I wrote this book, when I finished it eventually, I think it was published in 2017. But the one dictatorship was lacking. And then, at least in this country, we had January 6th. How, I mean, and now I'm teaching a course on dictatorship. So I have read and I came up with a lot of definitions of dictatorship. But all authors, I think, will agree that, or most authors will agree that when you have a regime that is not supported by, let's say, by an extra legality, which rejects the constitutional order and the results of elections, first, what motivates that, we call it a coup, and the outcome of that is a dictatorship. It cannot be called a democracy. If you have a president that lost elections, remaining to be the president, that cannot be presented as anything other than dictatorship. Of course, as you know, that didn't happen. But the intent was there. The wannabe situation, that's why I call these people wannabe fascists. So it's almost there. Like, my own approach is, I don't know, I'm less interested in the answer, whether this is full 200% fascism, or rather that we are seeing that populism, as the title of my talk presented, that populism is going into fascism, wannabe fascism, I call it. So I will finish there.
Let's open up for questions from the audience. So who wants to start?
Really fun talk. I really enjoyed it. So let's get to conceptual work, because that's one thing that political scientists focus on and historians, present company excluded, often don't do as much. And it's admirable that you try and do this. It's one of the things I like in your work. So a couple of things. When you're defining fascism and populism, are you defining movements or regimes first, or both? Now I was thinking that when you ran out these lists, that there were too many accompanying characteristics here, that it was descriptive. And what one really needs to do when one does conceptual work like you're trying to do is make a decision on what conditions define a concept. And you can either go necessary conditions that are minimal, or maybe radial conditions that you have several conditions. And if a certain percentage of them are there, then you have it, even if they're not all present, kind of thing. And so with your 4 pillars, you're moving towards necessary condition. And it does really differentiate between populism and fascism in a way that seems really effective. But the other thing a definition has to do is grab the referent from the reality and distinguish it from other things. And this clearly differentiates populism from fascism, but does it pass the test on other forms of dictatorship? And so are there other forms of dictatorship that have the 4 pillars? And I was thinking about this, and how, for instance, would the military dictatorships in the Southern Cone set in the 1970s, would they be fascist regimes? Because a lot of them had violence, xenophobia, dictatorship, militarization, and propaganda in their anti-communism. So would you then call those regimes fascist and break from most mainstream literature on the study of regimes in Latin America?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for these questions. And actually, they are truly helpful, because you are, asking me about a chapter that I will write. Okay, so part of my answer will be there. And, and I have been thinking, about this issue a lot. So I will have, like, one of the chapters will be on this issue of dictatorship. And actually, the way I'm conceiving this project is each chapter will be 1 pillar. So like and the last chapter will be on dictatorship. And I, for me, there is one way of answering this. Which is easier, is through my work, but that only applies to the Argentine case. And the rest, like, is a question that I keep asking. I will try to answer. Because as always is yes and no. Not in the particular sense of classic fascism, but the question itself needs to be applied. The same, let's say, concept, the same, let's say, 4-layer conceptual approach that I'm proposing. I need to apply it to these cases. I have applied, like, without this 4-pillar thing, but in my book, The Origins, the Ideological Origins of the Dirty War, my answer is that it's a typical historian's yes and no, because I analyze the history of Argentine fascist ideology from the classic moments of interwar fascism to the last dictatorship. And what I see is that in terms of, the world of their concentration camps and the most radical outcomes of that regime, yes, I mean, they were fascist. And yet that was connected in a typical Ernst Frankl way, right? This kind of almost, a perverse dichotomy between a world of legality or legal or pseudo-legality and the crazy world, like the most perverse dimensions of these ideologies. Let's say between a German civil court and Auschwitz. So this kind of dual situation, I mean, this dual state, that's a way to approach it. So in terms of the dual state, I mean, there are many connections. My own approach emphasizes the ideological ones. In the Argentine case, this was I was telling Carlos, it was terrible to write. I mean, difficult to write because my hypothesis led me to analyze a lot of materials that were extremely traumatic and traumatizing. But my idea is that inside the concentration camps, the idea was to literalize the ideology of Argentine fascism into the bodies of their victims. So, because one of the, let's say, I would say most, sorry to use a colloquial word here, but radical, I would say, but I was going to say insane dimensions of this was that they were not only torturing and eventually killing these people, but while they were torturing them, they were making them to listen to speeches by Hitler or Mussolini, or they were repeating some important tropes of the Argentine fascist tradition. So that, so my answer was like, yes, in the most extreme dimensions of this dual state, it was a fascist state. It was a world of fascism. And some people actually, particularly Jewish victims, they were saying like, where am I? Like, am I in Argentina or in Nazi Germany? And this is not a question of out of their imaginations. Torturers were telling them, Hitler lost the war. That's the difference between him and us. We will win it. We will do to you what we did to your ancestors in Germany. And of course, they were not in Germany. It was not the we that did it in Germany. It was not fascism, I mean, in Argentina during the dictatorship. So then, as you know, there is a debate on Pinochet that I will engage because, I don't see the same patterns, but I would have to, I would have a section on this because it's a key question. And I'm sorry not to be able to answer it because I need to write it and study, a little bit more. So in the Argentine case, yes, I will be interested in knowing which some patterns of demonization and especially, racism in Guatemala and their dictatorial repression. So we see elements. So here, we see elements. But what we are lacking, like in these particular South American dictatorships, is that they don't go from, from democracy to dictatorship, like most of them. They just do a more traditional coup d'etat, and they don't, in most cases, they will say, to use Schmittian terms, they will be commissarial. The idea was, in fascism, of course, the idea is to change the legal order to the extent that they create a new legality. Whereas the dictatorships, they just presented themselves as a bracket in history. So that will be another way to, to see a difference. There was no age of Pinochet. Like he will say, I'm an administrator, like I'm changing Chile in order for the time when Chile grows up to be different. And fascism was not about that. It was not creating a better version of liberalism or constitutional democracy. So there will be some yes and no's in the answers. So to me, the example that is obviously because, this is one of the areas in which I'm more of an expert, which is my country, that there was, before the dictatorship in Argentina, there was the AAA, which was a neo-fascist Peronist organization, which started in militarization of politics, and they killed over 1,000 people in democracy. So this is the pattern that is, I think, more fascist than the dictatorship itself, which is more traditional in the sense this is an army, it's the army organizing this, and so on and so forth. So to me, like the wannabe fascists, so whether there are fascist patterns, yes. Are they wannabe fascists in the sense that I will be studying here? No. Because what I'm interested in this is in this kind of populist democratic politicians that are undoing the populist dimension in order to enter fascism. So now as I try to think more the question, my answer will be this, that yes, I'm sure, and I will try to answer this in the chapter, there are some fascist dimensions, but the situation or the phenomenon is a different one. Because for me, this third wave is not this more traditional dictatorships, but rather like this, morphing of populism again into fascism, or this, I said once, like a reverse engineering of populism into fascism, which is exactly what it was not supposed to be. And I think, now, whether this was a choice, the Peronists had that choice in the 1970s. And it seems that some part of Peronism was going there. Perhaps we, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry not to be able to answer the question as fully as I would like to. I think I need to think more and also research more, while writing the book. Regarding, the previous question, the necessary conditions, I should have mentioned that most historians of fascism, including myself, we kind of agree with the three kind of layer definition that the Israeli historian Seb Sternhell and / political scientist Seb Sternhell provided, which is this idea that fascism can either be an ideology, a movement, or a regime, and only few times it has been both. Historian Robert Paxton tried also to present this as a stage, as a moment of stages. So the stage of regime generally is unusual. I mean, like there are not many fascist regimes. So that's why it's also risky to equate, fascism at large as a whole with regime. Now, in populism, we see the opposite problem, which is that the opposite tendency. In populist studies outside of Latin America, there is a tendency to study only movement and perhaps ideology, depending on the approach, but certainly not regime. So, and even in the case of Ernesto Laclau, he's not concerned at all about the issue of regime. As you, Carlos, pointed out, and also Andrew Arato pointed out, and others pointed out, I mean, this is an important lacking in Laclau. So, I mean, it's interesting that in fascism studies, the problem is, let's say, sometimes too much emphasis on regimes, and then in populism is the opposite, too much emphasis on movement and ideology. But so the point is like the necessary conditions is true that, I mean, in terms of dictatorship, it's hard because, when a fascist movement or a fascist ideology is asserting itself also as a dictatorial form. Now, in most fascisms, even when they are not in power, I mean, you can see this I was recently reading about, and I found some texts, because I don't read Urdu, but I found some texts in English, either reports or a short writing by the Mashriki, which was like this Indian Muslim fascist leader in Punjab. And he was never in power, but he says dictatorship is the form that we aim, as it happens in Germany and Italy. And this kind of, so even when they are movement or ideology, you can see that there is a dictatorial pattern. Now, that's why I insist on the wannabe, because it's not exactly the same, obviously. But there are, I mean, it's worrying enough that the idea is that they are asserting that an irreality of a particular, demand for regime change which is extra-constitutional and meaning dictatorial. And I was talking with a colleague, before, what happened in this country and other places that, there is this kind of common sense about certain constitutional norms is no longer shared by all the parties here. And and this is the crisis, which is, by the way, as I said, relying on propaganda and ideology and lies, and is manufactured. So it can be avoided by re-engaging with the Constitution and the constitutional process.
I'm not sure if you've looked into it or studied it, but do you have a position on the academic debate regarding whether or not what the system that existed in Imperial Japan around the time of the war was fascism or not? As this is a very big debate that most historians actually don't even talk about nowadays because they got tired of arguing over it.
Here, as in other dimensions of my work, I rely on my colleagues. And I know there is a big debate on that. And there is a difference between, because the issue here is, there was a fascist ideology and a fascist movement in Japan, of course. Now, to what extent, it became a Japanese fascist regime. And here there is a debate, as you said. And it's not that I have I cannot have a, I follow my colleagues here. What I see, if, let's say I tend to agree with those colleagues working on Japanese fascism, such as the historian Reto Hoffman, who argue that certainly there were some important fascist dimensions in the, the imperial notion of the kokutai, and other ideas about the state in Japan, which sounded like and were actually quite inspired by fascism. But what is interesting is that fascism can be many things. Rather, I mean, like it can serve different functions, right? Because the way like it served a certain idea of an empire in Europe, in Japan, was very different to the way in which it served a certain idea of anti-imperialism in India or Latin America. So my point is like that, I don't think that is a defining element, like for example, empire or anti-imperialism. Yeah, but sorry, not again, like I don't have a strong take. I kind of follow the lead of my colleagues. I'm not an expert on Japanese fascism, but I'm informed about the debates, obviously.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Clever. I'm from Ecuador, and I am interested in two things. I would like to ask two things. First, in Latin America, populism used to take the brotherhood of union, Peronism, exactly, like all people say, like all social movements, like a core of the movement, maybe. However, nowadays, other like a social movements has taken distance from the some current populism. I'm talking about the Ecuadorian case and like environmental movements, feminist movement. Under this consideration, is there a irreconcilable rupture between social movements and regimes and populist regimes in Latin America under your consideration? And the second is, nowadays people say the world is no longer a bipolar, like a right, left, conservative, liberal. Under this context, and the third, is there I mean, under this context, populism is a very hard to locate it, like in a study, like just like some bipolar under this context. Thank you.
Big questions regarding the state of populism in Latin America, and especially the relationship between movements and I will say this. I mean, in terms of my my presentation today, I will take it as an opportunity to explain the differences. Well, fascism was always on the right. Another big lie, actually, of the wannabe fascists, somehow you see this a lot in Brazil and in other places, that is that somehow there was some connection between Nazism and the left, and that is, I mean, antithetical to what fascism was in history. It was an extreme movement of the extreme right or the far right. It's as right wing as you can be, as it gets. Whereas populism, whereas it first emerged as a regime form from the right, it morphed into many things, and it was like less, fixed certainly ideologically than fascism. I don't want to say that it's a thin ideology, but I'm kind of saying that is a particular form of politics with regards, because it's very ideological to think that the democracy should not be necessarily liberal or constitutional is a big ideological take. I don't think it is a thin take, but it's not a fascist take, because fascists will say that democracy should not be, period. It should not be. Whereas populists say democracy should be something different to constitutional democracy or liberalism, or what Perón called I'm lacking the term. He said like demo. Which one? I think he called this. I'm sorry, I'm lacking the term. Sorry. No, he was talking about like this. He would talk about. Sorry, I remember. Demoliberalism. but the point is like then we see differences, right? Now, in terms of if I want to connect your question to my talk, I will say, or to my current concern, I will say that, I mean, left-wing populism remains to be more classical. I mean, in a way, ironically, more connected to either left and also right-wing forms. That in that sense, I mean, sorry to sound a little bit like perhaps many Italian colleagues will not agree, but in many ways, I mean, Berlusconi is closer to the Ecuadorian populists rather than Trump and Bolsonaro. But then Salvini is not. So the point is that, I mean, I don't think, you know, when I talk about wannabe fascism, I'm talking about the populist right and a particular trend in the populist right that is moving back into fascism. Now, in Venezuela, for example, we are witnessing something very different, which is a populism moving back to one dimension that early populists had rejected, which is the fourth pillar in my book, or my next book, which is dictatorship. I don't think, you know, you can call that a democracy, and I actually think that is way closer to what you can call a dictatorship in Venezuela at this point. But the other three elements are open to discussion. I don't think this is a xenophobic regime. I mean, yes, it has a use of propaganda, but I don't think it is as extreme. We might disagree. Perhaps you can even apply my model to Venezuela, but I don't think, you know, it is going into a fascist direction. Although certainly it already moved into a dictatorial one. So what, perhaps like also I will take the opportunity to stress this, that I'm analyzing in, you know, this new wave is only, so insofar as I see it, like a right-wing populist way. Because in order to approach fascism, I mean, someone that is on the left should have to cease to be on the left and become really a member of the extreme right, because that was fascism. Fascism was, you know, about that. So I'm pretty sure I didn't answer your question, but it's very, I mean, I prefer to stress like this other dimension. Now, and perhaps actually, you know, it's a little bit embarrassing because, you know, my colleague here knows way more about the topic of your question than I know. So perhaps you can also, no, it's not the time or the place. But my point is like, whether this, you know, I mean, and actually I learned, by the way, I can answer it by quoting Carlos here. I learned a lot about how eventually the most democratizing dimensions of certain left-wing populism, such as the one in Ecuador, the kind of dynamic of power actually minimize them, and the regime itself, you know, eventually move them away. I mean, perhaps we see similar trends in Bolivia and other places. Yeah.
We have a question from online, from our YouTube viewers. So Muriel asks if the professor has any insight on how he thinks that rising climate crisis and citizens' awareness or refusal of it plays into the upsurge in populist right-wing leaders.
That's a really good question. And you know, in my book on lies, I start the book in the first pages by making reference to the destruction of the Amazons and how this connects to Bolsonaro's ideology and politics. I mean, there is a correlation here. I mean, there is a total disregard for, you know, humanity, but also the earth. I mean, it's incredible how they are. I mean, many of these. That may be extremely polemic now, but with the same tenor of my book, I mean, how these liars are so anti-science, anti-earth, and you know, and anti, you know, anti-plurality. But it's part of the same package here, the same ideological package, at least as they present it. Because of course you can have forms of, you know, I mean, you can have forms of, you know, what they say, ecological fascism or whatever. But in history, generally, this was not a major concern. There was, I mean, dehumanization was also coupled in the history of fascism with, you know, a total lack of disregard for, you know, for the earth. I mean, I would say now, to be extremely theoretical about this, another layer or another way to put it is, as Adorno and Horkheimer put it, as a form of objectification of the world, right? Everything is an object, including the environment and the earth and the people. So the war against the war against subjects is also, you know, a war against the earth turned into an object. If that is the end, it's a very Frankfurtian new school kind of end. Yeah, please.
Professor, you talk about the 16 characteristics of populism in your book, and one of them says about populism brings like a radical nationalism. In Latin America, there are countries which have like a indigenous population, more black population as well. Therefore, are there like a ideological connection between nationalism and I'm talking about as a product of populism with the ideas, with the conception, what happened with this conception with the multiculturalism, constitutions, laws, some ideas of that. Thank you.
It depends. I mean, it depends on what you compare with, because I mean, it's true that, you know, in certain, well, it's part of the same pattern of change, right? That even if you incorporate this particular dimension, important dimension that you're asking about, like there's certainly a change between fascism and populism. In many ways, populism is majoritarian and anti-plural, but certainly more plural than, you know, than fascism. So the question is how the enemy is constructed, and this applies to different cases. And Carlos, for example, I mean, you explained the particularities of the Bolivian case vis-a-vis others. And even to the extent that you can ask questions about the Andes or other parts. I mean, I would say this, like generally, I mean, a distinction, I mean, going back, sorry, to the first question, because you asked me about the populism of the left question. Like I would say the distinction, I mean, if you want to focus on demonization or who is the enemy, in left-wing populism, or even in right-wing populism of the 20th century, vis-a-vis the new populism, the wannabe fascism that I'm talking about, what you see is that the notion of the people, of the us, of the we, is totally based on politics. I mean, you are a member of the anti-people, Perón will say, or Vargas or others, or you are a member of the anti-patria, if you don't agree with the leader or you don't follow the leader. If you don't think that the leader is the embodiment of the people, then you have to be the anti-people. And that is more important than whatever identity that you might have. And whatever other identity that you might have can be accepted only so far, but actually insofar as you recognize the leadership. So in the case of Argentina, for example, I was talking about, you know, Brazilian fascist Vargas. He agreed with the Nazis that Jews had no place in their societies. Whereas what Perón did with the Argentine Jewish community, you know, I'm Jewish also, which is so my community. So what he did is he closed, or he make it, you know, the main Jewish organization, the DAIA, the umbrella organization, he put a lot of pressure, they closed. What did he do with that? Well, then he created an Argentine Jewish Peronist organization. Because you can be Jewish, but you have to be Peronist. And the same applies to other, you know, like to many other identifications and you know, and experiences. And in populism of the right, to some extent, before this new wave, I think that was the case. Like if you were, I mean, to some extent, I mean, although they were more prone to a different form of the, let's say, a different definition of the people, okay? Because if I say, okay, the definition, the populist definition of the people or understanding of the people is rooted in the demos. So it's an issue of political identification. And that generally or mostly applies to populism of the left, some cases of the right as well. Now compare this with the fascist notion of the people. The fascist notion of the people doesn't matter as much. You can, you know, I mean, let's focus actually on the case of a former New School colleague. I never was my colleague, but was at the New School, Leo Strauss. He liked, I mean, and this is something that Hannah Arendt told him. Your tragedy is that you like Hitler and you are but they don't like you. And actually, so what happens to a Jewish person, whether this was right or not, is another matter, but that is for Hitler. That person cannot be a member of the people because the people is not understood as a demos, but as an ethnos. So in order to be a member of the people, you have to be a member of a particular ethnicity / religion, because ethnicity, you know, what is to be an Aryan? Well, they had to define it by religion because they couldn't do it otherwise, because it's not scientific at all, of course. So they check baptismal records. So who are the people in fascism is rooted not in a political opinion, but also, and even more importantly, on ethnicity / religion. Okay, so now let's jump. Let's do a big leap into the present. And you tell me who is American or who is Brazilian according to these understandings of the people. Is an American who is white and Christian a more legitimate American or not? I don't think so, but I'm certainly not a wannabe fascist. So let's study the wannabe fascists and let's see who are the real people for them, who are the base. This is a term, right? My base. So what is the base? Now, to the extent that, I mean, and the answer probably you will have as an informed answer as I can have, because this is a matter of, you know, assessment as well. But then my point is like, let's check. I mean, whether this idea of the people is more populist or fascist in Trumpism or Bolsonarism. Can you be absolutely Brazilian without being Christian within the world of Bolsonarism? You can be Brazilian, but are you going to be as legitimate? And perhaps in Trumpism, I don't know, my own point, my own idea is that no, they have a kind of very racist idea of the people. But perhaps if you disagree, you might find that this is not the case. Fine, then we are not talking about that. Anyway.
We have one more online question from Ryan. He says, at the beginning, you talked about new experts and non-experts. I wonder if you see these two groups doing anything important for the advancement of your study or the study of fascism generally.
The short answer is not much. But the more appropriate answer is that, well, I mean, I think, you know, for people that study these topics, they reaffirm the need of, you know, I think keep working and try to be to reach as much as we can, because I mean these kind of simplistic arguments, they have a long reach. I mean, if you say a big yes or a big no, it's easier to, you know, it's easier to teach, it's easier to, you know, to publish. It's easy for the, you know, to, you know, I think to also present it sometimes in you know, in certain media outlets. But on the other hand, is it historical enough, or is it scientific enough, or is it realistic enough? Because even if the answer is no, I mean, even if the answer is no, even if the US is totally, the US is not like the rest, even if that is the case, we can only arrive at that conclusion by departing from stereotypes and studying the issue. And perhaps the conclusion of a particular approach will be, yes, that there are no connections. But you have to study the issue. It cannot be a ban, you know, a ban on studying fascism vis-a-vis Trumpism, or populism vis-a-vis Trumpism, because as you know, even, you know, some famous scholars of populism, they said no, Trumpism has no connection with populism. Why not? I mean, let's try to assess or study it. So my point is, like, you know, we should ask the question. So if we accept the point that not asking the question, then, like, I mean, I don't think there is any future for studies of these issues. So I don't think we should accept that. So the effect, in a way, is reaffirming the need for more work and more complexity on these issues. So big no's or big yes are, you know, don't explain much. But they are easier to teach and publish, but they are problematic.
Stop now. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you, Federico. This has been fascinating. Thanks so much for your wisdom and your questions and your challenges. And well, let's give a round of applause to our guests.